Hello, and thanks for joining us today for this webinar on what are the most effective science teaching strategies. Andreas Schleicher, Director for the Directorate of Education and Skills at the OECD, and Tarek Mustafa, analyst with the PISA team, are joining us today to present findings from PISA's most recent working paper, which explores the association between teaching practices and students' science performance and science-related attitudes, such as enjoyment of and interest in science. The paper also looks at how different school and student contexts influence teaching practices. We will have time for a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to send your questions at any time during the presentation to Eric Magnuson. The PowerPoint that Andreas is presenting is available to download. Just click on Handout at the top of your screen to access the results. Now on to you, Andreas.
Thanks, Rose, and welcome. And I'm also glad that I have my colleague Tarek Mustafa with me, who's actually the mastermind of this very interesting analysis on science teaching. Science teaching is in everybody's mind. Attracting, developing effective science teachers has become crucial as jobs in science and math are expected to grow at a quite unprecedented rate. If you look at a growth rate of 28% projected between 2014 and the decade following that, that is really quite impressive. What we have tried to do is look at the association between teaching practices and science performance is measured by PISA. And the way we do that is actually by surveying both students and teachers about their experiences in science teaching. And then we look at the kind of factors that drive those kinds of outcomes. We've sort of looked at four broad classes of approaches in science teaching. First, inquiry-based science teaching. Students are basically asked to do something about science, to engage in science-related activities. Then more teacher-directed instruction, which is more sort of teacher-focused. Adaptive instruction, the extent to which teachers are responsive to different students' needs and interests and capacities. And then the feedback that teachers provide to students. So those are four broad classes that we question students on in the PISA survey. And then, of course, we were interested to what extent those practices relate to student learning outcomes, but also to how they relate to students' attitudes and dispositions. For example, their enjoyment of science, their interest in science, their belief in science, in the value of science in solving social kind of challenges, their self-efficacy in science, their belief that they can overcome difficult issues, and then also to what extent they themselves were open to become scientists at an age of 30. So those are the outcomes that we looked at beyond the performance in science. And let me sort of first talk a bit about inquiry-based science teaching. Basically, the idea here is that students develop a critical view, a way of engaging with science. They should not just know of science, knowledge about biology, chemistry, physics, but they should also have a deep understanding about a topic that they develop through scientific experiences. They should have a deep understanding of scientific methods, thinking like a scientist, and so on. That's basically what is behind that construct. And what we saw is that actually the prevalence of inquiry-based science teaching as reported by students varies quite significantly across countries. On the left side, you can see some countries, and they include high-performing school systems and not so high-performing school systems, where inquiry-based science teaching is very common according to students. And on the right side, you see a number of countries, again, some high-performing countries, some lower-performing countries, where inquiry-based science teaching was not so common. Basically, what we have done is construct an index, and the components of that index, the kind of questions that we ask students, are visible in the following chart, and basically also ordered by the relative frequency. Basically, here you can see the percentage of students who said that the following activities occur in most lessons, or at least all or in all lessons. For example, very common answer is students are given opportunities to explain their own ideas, or the teacher explains how science ideas can be applied. Very much at the heart of the inquiry-based concept. The teacher clearly explains the relevance of science concepts to our lives. Students are asked to draw conclusions from an experiment which they have conducted, and so on. So those are the kind of questions that we ask students in order to build that index of the prevalence of inquiry-based practices. Now, the big question, of course, is how those practices relate to outcomes. And one of the things that we found, contrary to what many of the experts that we work with predicted, is actually that inquiry-based science teaching tends to be negatively associated with students' performance. Not in all, but in many countries. A lot of this disappears when we control for student characteristics and observed and unobserved school factors, again, like the context in which schools operate and work and so on. But even after controlling for that, which is the blue bar, you can see that in most countries, there's still a quite important negative effect associated with a more sort of common approach around inquiry-based teaching. Now, the question then is that true for all student learning contexts? And in fact, what we saw is that it's not. Actually, we can see those negative effects most commonly in classrooms where there were issues with a more problematic disciplinary climate. Once we were controlling about it or looked at the students in the top quarter on disciplinary climate, those effects tended to be relatively or quite importantly smaller. So it's something that we can say that it's not true that it's a negative effect that we can see across all situations, but particularly in classrooms where disciplinary climate was problematic. But still, even in classrooms with a positive disciplinary climate, in some countries, you can see them marked in dark purple, we could see negative effects. So, what could explain that? Because again, many science educators underline the importance of inquiry-based teaching, engaging students in science inquiry processes to help them understand the methods and so on. But one of the criticisms that is often coming up is that actually presumes a lot of things. If you want to get students actually to think like a scientist and to work like scientists and to engage in scientific methods, you assume they have a lot of scientific knowledge already. And that may be true for scientists, but in science education, 15-year-olds, often learners may not have that extensive knowledge or training that professional scientists have. We also know that inquiry-based instruction is much harder to achieve, to do well, than maybe just the transmission of knowledge of science. Because guiding students in carrying out an experiment means you need to be open to a quite dynamic classroom situation where things can change. You need to react quite spontaneously. That's quite different than just transmitting scientific content. When you give a lecture, you can script it in advance, you can follow that script, but when you actually engage in scientific practice, a lot of things may happen that you don't expect, and a lot of things may happen for different students. Last but not least, the opportunity costs are high. It takes much more time to do an experiment than to just talk about it. So inquiry-based learning requires time, training, additional resources, and so on. So those are possible hypotheses for why we see those kinds of negative effects. What's interesting, one more thing on this. If you look at this the other way around, what can make inquiry-based science teaching successful? You could see disciplinary climate is a good hypothesis because we could see that the negative effects were largest in classrooms where students reported many disciplinary problems. Obviously, the availability of resources. You need a kind of laboratory, computer simulation software, and so on, and infrastructure in schools to do inquiry-based teaching. The training that teachers have to deal with the more dynamic classroom situations. Also, it's important to have a positive predisposition towards inquiry-based activities among teachers. In one way, you'd expect teachers to be real scientists, to convey that level of enthusiasm and the methods that are all involved and so on. So there are some real important prerequisites to make inquiry-based science teaching successful. But more encouragingly, what we saw is that students who are more exposed to inquiry-based activities enjoy science more and often a lot more. We created an index of enjoyment of science, where we basically ask students questions around the extent to which they enjoyed science learning. You could see basically that index when you move on the index of inquiry-based science teaching that I showed you before, by 1 unit, that's about 1 standard deviation, you could see the index of enjoyment jumped up quite a bit. And that's true before and after accounting for student and school characteristics. So this is not just the context that we're talking about, basically, for example, students in privileged backgrounds being more exposed to those kinds of practices. Even after controlling for that, you could basically see that those effects are quite large. So a close relationship between the prevalence of inquiry-based activities and student enjoyment of science. And it's not the end of the story. We could also see that students who were exposed to more inquiry-based activities showed generally higher levels of self-efficacy when dealing with science-related tasks. What I mean by this is when they were presented with scientific tasks that were really challenging, they had a greater level of confidence that they could overcome those kinds of challenges. And you can see those effects are significant and important in virtually every country, both before and after controlling for student and school features. And there's more to this. We also saw that the greater exposure to inquiry-based science activities relates to students' expectations of a career in science. In other words, where students experienced more inquiry-based approaches in science teaching, they were more likely to say that at the age of 30, they would want to become a scientist, or at least work in a science-related profession. Now, you can see in some of those countries, the effects are not statistically significant. I've made them here in lighter color, but in many countries, they are both before and after accounting for student and school characteristics. So 3 things: it's engagement, it's efficacy, and it's also career-related expectations. Let's move to teacher-directed science instruction. Basically, this is where teachers pursue a more frontal, more scriptive approach, where teachers are largely in control of both the content but also the dynamics of the lessons. That could include expository instruction, presenting information to students, and also class discussions, demonstrations of ideas. Those are the kind of questions that we associated with more teacher-directed instruction in the PISA context. Again, you can see where this is more common and where this is less common. And again, high and low performing countries are on both sides of the spectrum. It's not so easy to say that high performing countries use that or that technique. On the left side, you can see countries where there is a great prevalence of teacher-directed instruction. On the right side, you see countries where that form of instruction is less common. So again, let's look at some of the patterns. The first thing I want to show you, and I thought this was quite interesting, is that where countries use inquiry-based instruction, it doesn't mean that they necessarily use less of teacher-directed instruction. In fact, you can see some OECD countries in the upper right corner of this chart, where basically both of those types of practices are quite common. And in the same way, you can see some countries in the lower left quadrant, where you can see neither inquiry-based nor teacher-directed instruction is very common. So keep in mind, they are not mutually exclusive. They can go together or they can both be absent. But let's come back to actually the relationship with student achievement. What you can see here, different from inquiry-based instruction, teacher-directed instruction tends to be generally positively associated with better science achievement. And that's actually true a lot before accounting for student and school characteristics, but even after accounting for students and school characteristics. You can see in most countries, you talk about 7 score points on the PISA scale. That's quite a bit. That's almost, a quarter of the equivalent of a school year in some of the countries for which we can make those kinds of statements. So it's an important kind of association. We also see that teacher-directed instruction relates to students' enjoyment of science, both before and after accounting for school characteristics and student characteristics. And again, that's something that I would consider not only as statistically significant, but also an important effect in terms of the effect sizes that you see. And also, again, teacher-directed science instruction relates to students' expectations of becoming a scientist or working in a science-related career, like what we saw before for inquiry-based instruction. Again, effects tend to be a little bit smaller after accounting for student and school characteristics, but in most countries, they are still significant and visible. Now, one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, what if teachers combine those approaches? We saw before that inquiry-based teaching, on average, negatively related to learning outcomes. What if they are combined with teacher-directed instruction? And indeed, what you can see is that those effects tend to be quite importantly positive. You can see basically that is both teaching practices combined together is where you have the bar, and you can see basically different from only using inquiry-based teaching, where both approaches were combined, the effects tend to be more positive. But still, teacher-directed science instruction still comes out first, in terms of improved learning outcomes. So yeah, combining those two approaches seems to be sort of lifting the effect of inquiry-based teaching, but maybe not as much as one might have expected. Adaptive science instruction. Now, what do I mean by this is basically to what extent teachers respond to the diversity of students' needs, interests, capacities, and so on. And you can see on the left side, in some countries, that is quite common. You look to Portugal, you look to Singapore, Mexico, Denmark, Canada, and so on. On the right side, you can see countries where you have Belgium, Luxembourg, France, or Austria, where adaptive instruction is less common. So again, it's something that that we see happening in some countries, but not in many. So adapting science instruction relates to their performance. I think that's something that's also interesting. You can see where basically teachers do adapt lessons to students' needs as reported by the students. Once again, that's all coming out from students' voice. Basically, you can see that tends to be positively related to science performance, both before and after accounting for student and school characteristics, at least in most of the countries for which we have comparative data. And again, that's something probably that is quite intuitive. We also see that it's a strong predictor for students' enjoyment of science, where teachers were more responsive to individual students' needs. You could see that that was a quite good predictor for greater enjoyment of science, both before and after controlling for social background. And also here you could see where teachers were more responsive to students' individual needs. You could see that students were more likely to report greater career expectations of science at the age of 30. Again, that's something that seems to be true in most of the countries for which we have comparative data. Feedback. The last set of questions that we ask students is the extent to which their teachers provide them with individual feedback. And interestingly, this is also something where countries differ quite a lot. On the left side, you can see countries where students reported a lot of feedback from their teachers. On the right side, you can see countries where students reported that feedback was quite a lot less common. So interestingly also that those things are areas where countries really differ, at least according to the reports that students give us. And there might always be some kind of cultural kind of response related issues in this, but still that is something that the questions were standardized, so you could see some real differences across countries. When you look at the relationship between feedback and science performance, it tends to be negative. And that's probably what you would expect, because teachers are probably more likely to give more feedback to students who perform lower. When a student doesn't get something quite right, you tend to devote more time to them, to explain that to them, and so on. So that's basically what you can see. And again, a social background is an important mediator here. Often the kind of disadvantaged students are the lower performing students. They get more feedback. You take that effect out, then basically the blue bar gets a bit smaller, but the effect remains negative in most of the countries for which we have comparative data, even after controlling for student and school features. But again, that's what you would probably expect. What was interesting is that where teachers were giving students more feedback, students tended to believe more in science being a tool for inquiry. They tended to have greater epistemic beliefs, believing in the utility of science and solving social problems. And that was true also after accounting for student and school characteristics. In fact, in many countries, even more so. So teacher feedback as a positive predictor for students' epistemic beliefs. One of the things we ask ourselves, to what extent do those kinds of different teaching practices that we have now looked at relate to things like the size of classes? And what you can see is that in very small classes, up to 20 students, you could see that teacher feedback was a lot more prevalent, and as reported by students. And that's probably not a surprise, because in a smaller class, a teacher can devote more time to an individual student, and you're going to see that in students' responses. It's also true for teacher support, where students felt a degree of individual support for teachers. But for the others, we don't see that very small classes, for example, led to a lot more adaptive teaching or a lot more inquiry-based teaching, so on. When you look to classes from 26 to 30 students, you could see almost any of those approaches were less common. And also for students where classes where there were more than 30 students, you could see smaller classes tend to make certain teaching practices more prevalent. But again, remember, the teacher-directed practices that tend to be most positively associated with student learning outcomes, there is virtually no variability in this. And that's also something that we can see when you look at the relationship between class size and science learning outcomes. You don't find much of a relationship. And that could be explained that the kind of practice that is most directly related to student learning outcomes, teacher-directed practices, really don't vary much according to the size of the class. What varies is a perceived teacher feedback. Now there you can see basically as you move from left to right, it becomes less common. And that's not so much a predictor for the cognitive outcomes, but more so for the social and emotional attachment, including the career expectations. So you can see in this something really interesting. When it comes to the relationship between science teaching and class size, we don't see that much in learning outcomes. But when you look at the social and emotional attachment to science, that's where those factors through those different teaching practices may come out more clearly. Of course, there may also be indirect effects, things going on here, that certain things are done more in smaller classes. For example, you may intentionally put students requiring more feedback into smaller classes. Now, that's something that makes those analyses really complex and difficult to answer. Now, this is something that I found really interesting, and that's why I wanted to share it with you. We looked at how this plays out by gender. And I invite you to look at the prevalence of inquiry-based teaching. For example, we asked students whether they are more likely to expect in a science-related career, and then we related this to the prevalence of different approaches to teaching. And what you can see is that where girls experienced inquiry-based teaching, basically being sort of involved in doing science as opposed to just listening to science, they were a lot more likely to expect to work in a science-related career. The effect for boys tends to be smaller. If you think about it, maybe inquiry-based settings, classroom settings, are a way to close gender gaps, because the gender gaps often are not in terms of the performance. We see very little difference in the knowledge and skills of boys and girls in the PISA assessment, but we see very big differences in the extent to which they relate to science, in which they expect to work in science-related careers. That's really interesting. Boys and girls do similarly well in science, but boys are far more likely to work in technical and digital kind of careers, in science-related careers. So inquiry-based approaches to teaching may be one way to counter that effect. For teacher-directed practices, there you can also see where they were more prevalent, girls were more likely to actually expect a science-related career. For adaptive teaching, it was a bit the other way around. Boys were more likely to expect a science-related career, and also for perceived teacher support. So there were some really interesting gender patterns that, again, show us it's not just about averages, but different social groups may respond differently to different approaches to teaching, and that may have an effect on what they expect to do in their lives with what they learn in school. I already mentioned this. We also looked at the teaching practices and students' dispositions to science. You can basically see where inquiry-based teaching was more prevalent. You had a greater participation in science-related activities, both among girls and boys. Also a greater sense of self-efficacy. Students, boys and girls who practice science or engage in science seem to have a greater sense of being able to resolve difficult issues, enjoyment of science, interest in science-related topics. Whereas when you look at teacher-directed practices, you can't see those effects. Now, both boys and girls were not actually more engaged in the participation in science-related activities, nor were they sensing this greater enjoyment. So again, those kinds of dispositions towards science may well relate to a kind of different combination of teaching practices. Taking all of this together shows you that it's important, of course, to look at science knowledge and skills, the PISA test results, but it's also important for us to study in greater detail what is behind some of those patterns, and that they actually may work out quite differently for cognitive, social, and emotional aspects of science learning. So what do we conclude from this? We see that although inquiry-based science teaching tends to be negatively associated with science performance, some of that association is simply due to the context of learning. For example, a lack of disciplinary climate tends to amplify the negative effect of inquiry-based teaching on learning outcomes. So if you want to do inquiry-based learning well, you've got to take care of other aspects on the school context. We also see that inquiry-based science teaching is more effective than other practices in improving students' dispositions towards science. You could see that on the last chart. Many of the kind of social and emotional attachment to science is much greater where inquiry-based practices are more common. Also, you could see it could help close the gender gap, because girls seem to be responding most when it comes to their own expectations to work in science to those approaches. Teacher-directed practice instruction is most consistently related to better learning outcomes. Irrespective of the surrounding environments, it seems to work, for all kind of contexts that we observed. It seems to be working quite predictively across countries. In one way, you can say that inquiry-based teaching is just much, much harder to do. It takes the opportunity costs are higher, the requirements for teachers are higher, versus delivering well-structured lessons is something that works in all contexts and produces good cognitive outcomes, a little less so on the social and emotional side. Combining those approaches, you could see the effects were sort of slightly moderated, but I wouldn't draw too much from those kinds of things. When you look at adaptive teaching, that also is positively correlated with science performance. And that relationship you could see particularly strongly playing out in the Nordic countries, which are also known for their comprehensive education systems. There, basically, you have diverse, very diverse classroom settings. There's no tracking, no streaming going on. So teachers need to engage with students in personalized learning to a large extent. And exactly that's what you can see. So basically, those are education systems which do not respond through means of stratification to diversity, basically sorting students into different groups, but they respond to diversity by being very personal in the approach to science learning. You saw the negative association between teacher feedback and student science performance, and that's probably just a matter of reverse causality, that basically students who are low performers, they require more feedback, and teachers tend to engage with them more on providing feedback and so on. I think these are just a few conclusions, and I very much look forward to discussing them with you in the following. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. We have received several questions from our listeners. One listener would like you to explain more in detail what exactly is included in the observed and unobserved school characteristics that we accounted for in the charts.
Yeah, maybe I ask Tarek to explain that.
Yeah, so basically, in the analysis, we are accounting for students' background characteristics, such as their socioeconomic background, their gender, the number of science subjects they are taking during the year of assessment, and so on. And school observed and unobserved characteristics could include any school-related factors. So this could be anything related to school policy, leadership, school type, whether it's public, private, whether it's vocational or general education track. So we are accounting for lots of background information in order to net out the effects of teaching practices.
Right. Thank you, Tarek. We've received several questions on inquiry-based teaching practices. So one listener would like to know what else can be done to assess the effects of inquiry-based science teaching.
Yeah, I think so far in the PISA context, we have a range of social and emotional outcomes here, career expectations, self-efficacy, enjoyment of science, and we have cognitive outcomes like science performance. That's what we basically use to look at the relationship between inquiry-based teaching. But obviously, there are many other dimensions one could be looking at. But what we felt was really important is not just to look at student learning outcomes, because if you do well in a school test in science, but you don't like science, you don't believe in science as a method of inquiry, you don't want to become a scientist, then obviously we have done something wrong. So we wanted to look at a quite complete picture of cognitive, social, and emotional outcomes here.
All right, thank you. Someone else would like to know, why is the association with inquiry-based learning negative when we rely on student reports, while it is positive when we rely on teacher reports? I think this was addressed in the paper.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And again, when we surveyed students, we asked them very specific situations in the classroom which they experienced. That's basically the implemented practice. And there we can basically see whether more those implemented practices are common in the classroom, they're more likely learning outcomes were negative. When we survey teachers, we talk more about intended learning practices. And perhaps, you have some teachers who are really very good at that, who believe in those kinds of methods and who are very good at them. And that's basically one possibility why teachers might that the sort of teacher observed factors might relate differently to the outcomes than the student observed factors. Basically, for students, you look at all of the teaching experiences they have and how prevalent inquiry is, and yet there you can see probably the negative experience dominate. Whereas where we survey teachers, they probably have a very conscious view of intended practices, and those who respond positively to those practices may have very specific approaches to this. That is an hypothesis. It's very difficult to discern because all we have here are the different perspectives. But it's, again, one of the strengths of PISA that it offers an approach of triangulation. I think not only relying on one set of responses, but you can look at this through the lens of teachers, through the lens of students in terms of their experiences.
Right, thank you. It seems as if all teaching strategies are positively correlated with enjoyment and interest in science. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's what you would hope, that most approaches to teaching will lead to better learning outcomes in a way. What we did not, I should also say, we did not frame the questions in terms of trade-offs and choices. So teachers could respond to those questions independently. You might have got a different result if we had basically presented them as choices, where basically doing more inquiry-based teaching means I do less teacher-directed teaching. That's not the way we ask those questions. We ask them independently, and you'd, in a way, hope that what teachers do will also contribute to improved learning outcomes, but to a different extent.
Someone was wondering, did the paper address teacher collaboration and its effect on science teaching practices used in class?
Tarek, you might want to reflect on that.
So basically, in PISA, we do have data on teacher collaboration from the school questionnaire, which is answered by the school principal. However, teacher collaboration is not, seen or explored in this paper because it doesn't directly relates to activities with students. So it's not a teaching strategy in itself. However, I think we found in previous reports, so in the initial reports for PISA 2015, some positive correlations between collaboration between teachers and student outcomes. And we also found a positive correlation between collaboration and teacher job satisfaction, actually, in a previous working paper that was published this year.
All right, thank you. I do have a follow-up question, so it might relate to other reports. Are there countries that offer effective professional development activities to teachers to help them develop best practices? Do you have any examples?
Tarek, you want to take that? This is not really part of the paper, but you might have other kind of research.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what we found is that, for instance, inquiry-based science teaching is very sensitive to the environment, very sensitive, as Andreas said, to the ability of the teacher to deliver these kind of activities. So I imagine that teacher training would play an important role in providing teachers with pedagogical resources and with the appropriate training, and maybe the dispositions as well towards these kind of challenging teaching techniques. But this is something that we could explore as well in the future.
Yeah, I would want to say this is an hypothesis. We really don't know at this point.
Yeah, of course. One listener said that it is difficult to disentangle directions of causation between teaching strategies and education outcomes. Could you please talk about how you tried to overcome this challenge?
Yeah, that's a true comment. Basically, what we look at here is a relationship between the two. And as I mentioned, for example, when you look at the feedback variable, it could go in both directions. The reason why we see a negative relationship between the prevalence of feedback and student learning outcomes is most likely that those students who need feedback most are the lower performing students. So that's where you can see where reverse causality comes in. So I think what we can see is basically to what extent specific approaches to teaching tend to relate to specific types of cognitive, social, and emotional learning outcomes. But still, I would argue that those kinds of relationships are a good starting point for deeper inquiry. Now, when you see, for example, that there is a positive relationship, well, that's probably a good starting point for looking at why.
Tarek, would you like to add?
Yeah, in terms of, so we tried to carry out some further analysis, which are included in the paper, where, for instance, we try to investigate, for instance, these relationships. So as Andrea said, teacher feedback is negatively correlated with performance because students who are the low performers tend to get more feedback. But then we try to control for the intensity of the feedback, and it seems that those who get the most feedback tend to be those who where the negative correlation is. And we also try to control for performances in other subjects, so in reading and in mathematics, just to control for the student's ability. And then in this case, the negative association between teacher feedback and performance disappears. When it comes to inquiry-based science teaching, we know, for instance, that this practice is more common in vocational schools. So it's very important to control for school observed and unobserved characteristics in order to ascertain some of this, to explain some of this relationship. So yes, we could have reverse causation, but there are ways of dealing with these issues analytically that we are exploring in this paper.
Right, thank you. Someone asks, does the OECD have plans to study how teacher characteristics relate to teacher practices?
Yeah, in fact, we have another survey called TALIS, where we, which is quite extensive in the questions it asks to teachers about the work organization, the practices, the environment in which they work. That's basically where we look at those kinds of relationships. Data for this will be published in June next year.
All right, thank you. I think that's all the questions we have. There was one more question. What else can be done to assess the effects of inquiry-based science teaching? If you would like to address that question.
Well, I would like actually to see more analysis around the impact of the environment. So in this paper, we examined disciplinary climate and some student characteristics, but we could, I think, do more when it comes to some other school-related factors or teacher preparation for inquiry to teaching. Using inquiry activities and so on. So there are still areas that we could investigate more.
Thank you both. Thank you, Andreas, and thank you to our participants for your interest in PISA and the OECD's work on education. If you would like to find out more about PISA, we invite you to visit our website, www.oecd.org/PISA. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the PISA website. Once again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for hosting us, Rose.
Thanks.